A day after the IDF announced the murder of 6 Israeli hostages in a Gaza tunnel, the country is mourning their loss, with citizens gathering at funerals and vigils across the nation to say their final goodbyes. ILTV's editor-in-chief Mayan Hoffman has more.
Israel is deep in mourning today. Across the nation, citizens are gathering at funerals and vigils, grieving the loss of 6 young hostages brutally murdered by Hamas in a Gaza tunnel. Among the victims announced yesterday were Israeli-American Goldberg-Polin, Carmel Gatz, Edin Yerushalmi, Alexander Lovanov, Almog Sarusi, and Master Sergeant Ori Danino. In Jerusalem, a candlelit vigil was held last night to honor 23-year-old Goldberg-Polin, whose story captured the hearts of many. His parents, Rachel and John Goldberg-Polin, had tirelessly advocated for his release, making his name known around the world. Hirsch was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival near Gaza, where he was filmed by Hamas gunmen having just lost part of his left arm. He was seen being loaded into a pickup truck and driven into Gaza with other hostages.
This was not the outcome that we hoped for, and the heart breaks. All day you woke up, I heard the news, and I just felt my heart was broken all day.
Today, Hirsch was laid to rest in Jerusalem. Yesterday, the family of Almog Sarusi also said their final goodbyes. His parents wept as they spoke at the funeral of their 27-year-old son. Grief struck another family as Shai Dickman broke down in tears herself, mourning her cousin, 40-year-old Carmel Gatz, who was kidnapped from her home in Kibbutz Be'eri.
It's too late for us. It's too late for Carmel. I will never hug her again. But 101 people can still hug their families. For them, make the deal, save lives.
Ori Danino, who had escaped the Nova Music Festival, was tragically kidnapped when he returned to rescue his friends, including Omer Shem Tov, who remains in Hamas captivity. Corinne Unger, Shem Tov's 21-year-old cousin, condemned the failure to secure a ceasefire deal that could have saved the hostages.
I'm sorry that the world failed those beautiful 6 souls and their families.
This is a wound that cuts deep, not just for the families of the hostages, but for all the nation of Israel who believed in the possibility of their return. Now, the people of Israel will work to honor their lives.
Reports from Washington indicate that following the murder of 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza, the U.S. plans to present a take-it-or-leave-it ceasefire deal. U.S. officials said President Joe Biden's months-long push for a ceasefire and hostage release deal faced renewed urgency after Israeli forces recovered the bodies of 6 hostages, including Israeli-American Goldberg-Polin. The report also indicated that Washington may walk away from the mediated talks if the sides still fail to agree. The United States has been talking to Egyptian and Qatari mediators about the contours of a final take-it-or-leave-it deal that plans to present to the parties in the coming weeks. One that, if the 2 sides fail to accept, could mark the end of the American-led negotiations. U.S. officials said, you can't keep negotiating this. This process has to be called at some point. A general one-day strike was called today by the Histadrut labor union to express outrage over the Hamas murder of 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza. Mass protests were held today and overnight, demanding more action to bring the remaining hostages home. The government insists that Hamas is still stalling a deal and not Israel. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the report.
As funerals are being held for the hostages murdered in Gaza, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets to demand more action to secure a deal for the remaining hostages' release. Main roads were blocked for hours. The protests were mostly orderly, but there were some clashes with police and arrests.
We see firsthand that they don't have any more time. The hostages are dying in the tunnels by Hamas. They've been murdered, and we have no more time. We need them home now.
The protest was given a jolt when the Histadrut Labor Federation called a one-day strike to protest the government's Gaza strategy for a hostage for ceasefire deal. Union chiefs and business leaders joined forces in the national outpouring of grief, fury, and protest after the bodies of 6 hostages who were known to be alive only days ago were returned to Israel for burial.
מחר אנחנו חייבים לזעוק את זעקת הארץ האהובה שלנו. חייבים לזעוק את זעקת החטופים, העקורים, ההרוגים שלנו. חייבים להחזיר את מדינת ישראל לשגרה.
The decision by Histadrut leader Arnon Bar David included a shutdown at Ben Gurion Airport and the broadest expression of anti-government dissent since the start of the war on October 7th. But not all local authorities agreed with the decision to strike, and the government called the non-labor-related Histadrut action to be misdirected and illegal. Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that Hamas and not Israel is stalling a potential hostage deal.
And with ongoing strikes and protests across the country, the feeling of a division is undeniable. But ILTV's Ariel Elachiani is in Tel Aviv to bring us a snippet of unity and hope.
Following yesterday's devastating news that 6 of the Israeli hostages have been murdered by Hamas while in captivity in Gaza, we are seeing hundreds of protests and strikes across the country today in an effort to put pressure on the government to do everything they can to bring the remaining hostages home. And whilst in one respect this is a great show of unity as we are supporting and standing with the hostages, we are also seeing a great sense of division across the country. And this is sparking a true heartbreak among many Israelis and the diaspora. And so I'm here now out in Tel Aviv to speak to some people and try and find a glimpse of positivity and unity.
I think at the end of the day, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right, black, white, it doesn't matter, Jewish, Muslim, at the end of the day there are people suffering, and that's what we need to unite behind and support, and that's what we need to fix, and that's what we need to focus on right now. Instead of getting caught up in the politics of it, we just need to think about the humanitarian side, and there are really people suffering and we can help them.
I think just understanding that when we're apart, it only feeds our enemies. It feeds the Islamic Republic. It feeds Sinwar. When they see us divided, it just gives into what exactly what they want. And what we need to do is we need to unite against our enemy and not be divided and parted as a nation.
I think we all need to remember why we are doing it. I mean, we are doing it not only for the hostages, we are doing it for ourselves, for our future. And I think that if we want to build here a better future, we must do it together and we must bring them home.
I moved like 15 times in my life to different locations, and Israel just has the most genuine people. People just say what they think. No filters, they wear it on their sleeve, and it's the most beautiful culture and the most beautiful way to live.
I think that the war brings very bad things, but also very good things. As a girlfriend that lost her boyfriend 8 months ago, I can say that the love and the support that I got from, of course, my friend, but from people that I don't know and I never met, it was amazing. And I think that this is our power.
One thing I love about Israel, that wherever you walk on the street, you just feel like you're at home, you feel safe. It's not like the diaspora where you have to be scared to be a Jew. You can openly be Jewish on the streets, and it's just the most beautiful thing and amazing thing in the world.
We are together in this, and we are very support each other. So I think this is what I like about Israel, that we are a small country, and we are all in this together.
As Israelis mourn and bury their loved ones, frustration is growing due to the lack of a hostage for ceasefire deal. Anger is mounting over the government's failures and the lack of accountability in bringing our hostages home. Now, joining us to discuss these challenges to unity in Israel today is former MK and founder of Yad Le'olim, Dove Lipman. Dove, thank you for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on, although I wish it was in better circumstances. I want to start by asking you, you've seen what's happening in the streets. There's a massive strike today. Israelis are angry. Can you explain a little bit about why there is so much frustration today with the Israeli government?
Absolutely. I mean, it's certainly a day of unbelievable emotion here in Israel. People are just devastated, even if we remove the politics from it, just to know that these 6 hostages lived for 11 months and as of last Thursday were presumably alive. It's very, very painful and it's very, very devastating. What's important to note, though, is that the country is absolutely divided on this issue. Of course, the protests make a lot of noise, and that's just the nature of demonstrations and closing streets and strikes. But there are 2 forums. One is called Tikva, one is called Gvura. One represents soldiers that have been killed, others that have children that are hostages who are saying no to a deal. And they're saying we have to show strength and keep showing strength. And that's the approach that we have to have. And in fact, the courts in Israel just ruled that the strike from the labor union was political in nature and it ordered everyone back to work. So the country is very divided. It's a very emotional issue. I'm not here to give my opinion about it. There's merit to both sides of a really complicated issue against a monstrous terrorist entity called Hamas. And the country is divided. And then the emotions of the day just bring that to an even greater explosion.
Now, there is division even within the government, not talking about the opposition and coalition, but within the coalition. What should be done regarding the hostages and what concessions can be made? Is there any way that these gaps can really be bridged in order to help bring these people home?
To be very honest with you, and I'm sad to say it, not from a political place, just because I feel for the hostages and their families, I don't see a way for these gaps to close. The demand that Israel leave areas where we know with certainty that the moment we leave, the terrorists will begin to smuggle in weapons, begin to fire missiles again at us, put our soldiers at risk. That's a decision which this government has made. We cannot do that. We cannot do that. There will be future deaths because of it. And that's exactly the struggle here. The struggle here is, are they going to kill the hostages right now? Or are they going to kill Jews and Israelis later? And that's really the battle here. I think both sides care about life. The big question is, do you risk things in the future by giving up very, very strategic areas, by releasing murderers from prison to get people back who are alive right now? And there's certainly merit to that. Or do you say, I can't do that because we have to show strength. We cannot leave these strategic areas. We have to be thinking long term. And right now, if you're asking me, Emily, I think that this government, and I'm not saying right or wrong, this government has taken a stance which says we have to be thinking long term as well and long term strategically. And that, unfortunately, at the moment, given the nature of Hamas, means that I don't see how a deal to bring the hostages home can possibly be made.
It's insane that we're dealing with this reality, but it seems it really is a Sophie's choice. It's a lose-lose no matter what the Israeli government decides. At this point, what can Israel's leadership do to bring people together, to unite the country in such a divisive and painful time?
I'm so happy that you asked that question, because that is what Israel needs more than anything else. Like you said, this choice is impossible. It's a lose-lose. We're in a very difficult place right now. But as a country, we can disagree. We can disagree with each other, but we have to find a way to disagree agreeably. Someone told me on Shabbat, I'll share it very briefly, it's in Hebrew, but the word yachad, which means together, can also stand for the acronym Yesh Chilukei Deot. There are differences of opinion, and that's okay. We're going to be that way, but the leaders need to be projecting that. And my own personal opinion is I think that we have to be tapping into the incredible inspiration that has existed during this very dark time. The unbelievable soldiers, even the families of the hostages and families of soldiers. There's so much to learn from them in terms of their dedication to our people and to the cause, and to somehow find that unifying point, which is we're all in this for the right reasons. We're all in this to try to figure out what's best for Israel. Let's constantly remind ourselves about that as we're having the debates, but not let it get to the point where it pulls us apart and we become weak because we are so polarized that we can't even sit at the same table together.
Absolutely. Well, we are out of time, but Dove Lipman, thank you so much for joining us and for, in a way, your message of hope today.
Thank you for having me. We should share good news one to the other.
The IDF anti-terror operation is continuing in Samaria with a focus on Jenin. In Judea, the IDF tracked and killed the terrorist gunman who murdered 3 police officers yesterday near Hebron. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
IDF forces tracked down and killed the terrorist gunman who killed 3 police officers yesterday in a roadside ambush near Hebron. The gunman was tracked to a building in Hebron where he was holed up, following intelligence on his whereabouts provided by the Shin Bet security agency. Troops of the Duvdevan commando unit surrounded the building, using tactics to force the gunman out. The terrorist was identified as Mahand al-Sauda, 31-year-old, identified with Fatah, and a resident of the village of Idna. In the past, he served in the Presidential Guard as part of the Palestinian Authority's security apparatus. The investigation into the attack continues. IDF anti-terror operations are continuing with a focus on Jenin in northern Samaria. IDF officials were surprised by the large number of explosives the terrorists had planted on roads around and within Jenin. The Bislach Brigade has been deployed to reinforce Samaria for the past 2 weeks. The operation aims to increase pressure on terror organizations in Samaria in response to escalating warnings and attacks. During the night, the Air Force hit a Jenin terror squad after they were identified as throwing explosives at forces operating in the city.
It's day 332 of the war in Gaza, and the ongoing warfare is continuing on the northern border, where 3 Israelis were wounded by a Hezbollah-guided missile. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
On the northern border, a Hezbollah anti-tank guided missile attack wounded 3 Israelis, including a civilian who was seriously hurt and a member of the Kfar Yuval local security team who was moderately injured. The civilian, in his 40s, was evacuated to Rambam Medical Center in Haifa by helicopter. Ziv Medical Center said the security team member and a 3rd person injured in the attack were in good to moderate condition and were being treated in hospital. IDF jets struck Hezbollah targets in South Lebanon after 10 launches were detected in the western Galilee. Most fell in open areas, and there were no casualties. The IDF struck Hezbollah targets in a number of areas in South Lebanon, hitting the launching sites and terror infrastructure. Turning to Gaza, where IDF Chief of Staff Halevi visited the point in Rafah where the bodies of the 6 Israeli hostages were found murdered. Halevi met with commanders and fighters in the field. There was a situation assessment, learning, and planning for future hostage rescue or body retrieval operations. Meanwhile, the fighting in Gaza continues. Fighter jets attacked a Hamas command and control complex located in the area that was previously used as the Tzapad school in Gaza City. The command and control complex was used by Hamas terrorists to plan and carry out terror operations against IDF forces. Before the attack, many steps were taken to reduce the chance of harming civilians, including the use of precision weaponry and additional intelligence information.
Well, it's been a decade since Islamic terror group ISIS beheaded American-Israeli journalist Steven Sotlov, whom they kidnapped. Who would have thought that a decade later we would still be facing the same barbarism both from ISIS and from regimes like the Islamic Republic, along with all its proxies, including Hamas. As Israel mourns the brutal execution of 6 of our hostages, here with us to discuss the threat of Islamist terror is Felice Friedson, who was a close friend of Steven Sotlov. Felice, I want to thank you for joining us today in these difficult days. To start, can you tell us about Steven? Who was he? What was his story? And ultimately, what happened to him?
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. And I have to tell you, it's really bittersweet. On a day when you see that Goldberg-Polin is being laid to rest, I think back to that decade ago, that brutal execution, the beheading of Steven Sotlov. He came to us at the Media Line in 2009, a courageous, bright young man who spoke Arabic. He was a dual citizen, the United States and Israel, and he was going throughout the region. 2009, I did not hire him. I was afraid he'd get killed. 3 years later, he had studied the region. He had gone to the region. He had been everywhere from Libya to Bahrain and Syria and Yemen. He was telling the world about what happened, what was going to go happening in relationship to Al-Qaeda and to the jihadist terrorist groups, and relationship to what went down with ISIS. ISIS hadn't even really had a name of ISIS at that point. I think that it is so important to understand that he was there to document the history of what was happening in the region, and we witness today that not much has changed. ISIS is back, and back in quite a big way.
You know, it has been 10 years since his tragic murder, and ISIS does remain a threat, but unfortunately, they're not the only one. Why do you think we're seeing an increase in these Islamist radical terror groups who are committing these heinous acts, as we saw this week with Hamas or 10 years ago with Stephen?
They know they can get away with brutal tactics. They right now also have the capability of using the net in a vast capacity in multiple languages to reach people who want to join these terrorist organizations. And they're doing it well. I think that it's very hard for the intelligence agencies to keep up with the kind of network that they have created. If you look at Yahya Sinwar, if you look at the fact that Israel has not isolated him yet, maybe they do know where he is. Maybe they can get to him, maybe they can't. But this is what you have in terms of terrorist leaders that come and go all over these countries. And look at Libya right now. We just wrote a story on Libya on the fact that Libya could be facing a revolution. No one's even looking at this country because there's so much turmoil elsewhere. If we look at what's happening from the Houthis in Yemen, no one would have even understood or thought who a Houthi was, let alone how they've disrupted the entire Red Sea and all the shipping, that the industry itself at large is creating havoc amongst the world. That is critical for economy, and it's vital for the entire world to clamp down on what's happening and to understand these assets.
I think there's been somewhat of a misperception that the conflict is about Israel, when in fact it's not actually about Israel, as we see by this pattern of behavior. I think there's also been a bit of a reluctance to attribute some of the savagery from these terrorist groups that we've seen in the West due to fear of being labeled Islamophobic. I'm wondering if you have a take on this. Is there a reasonable approach to this? Does it prevent a true understanding of the risks of these groups when the discussion is shut down, with accusations of Islamophobia?
I think that people can't fear today the labels that are existing. They have to come forward and speak out about the acts that are taking place. I think part of it is to shut down the public from coming forward and being able to discuss these atrocities. When you have somebody beheaded in front of the world, and today most people don't even know who Stephen Sotloff is, let alone James Foley, 10 years later, something is very wrong if we can't address the fact that there's barbaric acts committed every day, and the fact that we have these groups totally creating havoc in the world. So we have to call out what's happening, and the intelligence agencies have to be strong, and the governments can't be held hostage by these groups. And that's part of what we're seeing as well. They can't placate terrorists. They need to be able to have all kinds of checks and balances on what we're seeing happening, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's slavery, which is happening too, because they are taking people against their will, and some of these people are not capable of responding. So quite frankly, Emily, I think the only action here is strong action and strong words against what exists today on a very global scale, whether it's Latin America, Europe, Africa, or the Middle East. And let's not forget the streets in the United States. We can't leave that out.
Absolutely, and the campuses, even the campuses. Well, Felice, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us today and, of course, for reminding us of Stephen's story and his tragic accident that happened.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sagot Winery, where passion meets tradition. Nestled in the heart of Binyamin, our vineyards yield exquisite wines crafted with generations of expertise.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Mostly clear skies are expected tonight around the country, as temperatures should reach lows of around 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Tomorrow, sunny skies and warm weather is back, with temperatures reaching highs of 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channels, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, iltv.tv. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Emily Schrader. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.